Frederick, you asked about my intellectual relationship to Claude Lévi-Strauss, and it goes very deep. Indeed, when I was a student at the University of Toronto under David Turner was in communication with Lévi-Strauss about elementary structures of kinship, and there was a very fruitful dialogue between them in that regard. So I was exposed to Lévi-Strauss's thought that way. I then went to study with Rodney Needham, and let's just say that the relationship between Needham and Lévi-Strauss was not a warm one. And so in some ways, I didn't talk about Lévi-Strauss and my interest in his work during that time, but I was thoroughly immersed in it, thoroughly conversant in it, and it has continued to inform my thinking. So, for one thing, I'm intrigued by this idea of the science of the concrete. I think that's a very powerful notion. So you have the abstractions of modern physics, and on the other hand, you have this idea of a science of the concrete, using analogies between sensory qualities to construct an order in the cosmos. In a way, I see all of my work on the senses as directly descended from that. I am interested in the sensory qualities of things, the sensory qualities of kula shells, for example, the sensory dimensions of atmospheres. And so I took great inspiration from that idea of the science of the concrete. And not that I reject modern physics, not at all, but I think that actually, by attending to the senses, there is a great deal to be learned. Just as an example, in one of my books, Empire of the Senses, one of my favorite chapters is by Lisa Roberts. It's called The Death of the Sensuous Chemist. And it brings out how chemists, prior to the revolution that Lavoisier introduces in the 18th century, chemists tasted and smelled solutions to determine their composition. This was that, and observing them, the colors and so forth, was the way to determine what they were made of. Before all the tests that become standard after Lavoisier, people had to use their senses, and they elaborated a vocabulary of incredible precision, to communicate from one person to another these sensory impressions. I would love to go and study, how we might bring back those languages that are so rich in sensory description. So yes, you can run a test and you can think you've got it nailed, but this idea of the senses as a litmus, this, I think, needs to be explored as well. So one thing is the way in which, my research on the senses and material culture studies as sensory studies, continues that idea of the science of the concrete. But the other idea, that truly fascinated me was that little section in The Raw and the Cooked called the Fugue of the Five Senses, in which Lévi-Strauss is actually interpreting the sensory codes of Amerindian myth, and he notes all the sensory transformations and substitutions that occur, and the meaning of those sensory operations, as he calls them. So this idea of a fugue of the five senses is deeply appealing to me. And actually, one figuration of it occurs on the cover of my forthcoming book, The Sensory Studies Manifesto. It's a graphic by the graphic designer, Eric Adigard, who's I was very much honored that he made this image for the cover of my book. And it's entitled Kaleidoscope. And the idea is actually one that comes from McLuhan, who talks about the kaleidoscope of the sensorium. the idea of the senses, like with a kaleidoscope, being combined and recombined, shifting constantly, like in a fugue. And so this idea of fugue of the five senses from Lévi-Strauss, the idea of kaleidoscope from McLuhan, and the idea of the sensorium as this dynamic whole where the relations among the senses and then within each sense between different sensations are constantly undergoing all these transformations is very, very dear to me. And that dynamic model of the sensorium, that's what I like to lead with. I mean, to me, anthropology of the senses is about leading with the senses, just as Lévi-Strauss said we do with the science of the concrete. So leading with the senses, focusing on the relationships. How are the senses relationally produced? How do they combine, recombine, transform, and working out all of those kinds of sensory patterns. I find endless interest in doing that. And let me just say, I shouldn't say this, but let me just say it anyway. There is nobody after Lévi-Strauss, okay? The post-structuralists, the deconstructionists, they are just footnotes to Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss said it all with his idea of structuralism. And so I find these other subsequent developments to be less than what structuralism already accomplished. I don't want to diminish Foucault or Derrida or Deleuze and Guattari or any of them, but really the structuralist turn is what gives us post-structuralism, what gives us deconstruction and so forth. And Lévi-Strauss, I would say, even anticipated what's sometimes called the affective turn. And I think of a book which I have on the table over here, La Potière Jalouse. Okay, I mean, Lévi-Strauss was concerned with the orchestration of emotions or affects as much as the play of structures. And so, there's tremendous wealth to be found there in that body of work. But again, I don't dismiss any of the intellectual movements that have come since, but I'm just conscious of how they all represent dismemberments of structuralism. But actually, if we study structuralism in sufficient depth, we can find it has so much to give. One last thing, and that is this idea of the fugue of the five senses. Together with my colleague Chris Salter, who's a professor of design and computation arts, over the last 10 years, we have created various performative sensory environments. And these are environments that are quite unique. They are, for purposes of modeling and communicating information about cultures, but they do so through the medium of the senses. So a performative sensory environment will consist of light, sound, and smell, and motion, and texture, and so forth, and only those sensations, but arranged, if you like, as a fugue or as a symphony. And the idea is that stepping into one of these environments can open a crack in the Western sensorium because the visitor has their senses rearranged, if only temporarily, and they can experience the way in which the senses are orchestrated in some other tradition than our own. So in recent years, we've been collaborating with Indigenous artists from Canada and from Australia to create such intersensory, intercultural laboratories for sensory experimentation. And again, what these installations or performance pieces do is they stage the kaleidoscope of the sensorium. They stage the fugue of the five senses. And so, again, the inspiration, goes back to Lévi-Strauss and just seeing how tremendously productive some of those notions might be. So, Lévi-Strauss was very dominant when I was doing my first degree 1976 to 79. And I've never shaken him off, nor do I want to, because I think there is so much there to be mined and to be contemplated and to be elaborated further. I think that the most important thing that we can do with regard to the senses per se is, in that regard, however, to indigenize them. And this is where it's not just the anthropologist sort of studying the senses of others, but indigenous scholars teaching us about new ways of sensing that is so key. So this is one opening that I think is very important, and maybe just by way of closing, I can point to the work of Dylan Robinson, a Stolo scholar at Queen's University in Kingston. And Dylan has a book called Hungry Listening, a very important book about indigenous approaches to orality, indigenous approaches to hearing, and how to get beyond colonial strictures in that regard. Very important work. And he also has a book with a number of other Aboriginal scholars and artists, the subtitle of which is Arts of Engagement. And it's about all the artwork that was produced by Indigenous artists alongside the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada hearings and report. And there too you will find Indigenous artists engaging our senses in ways that hopefully can lead to their decolonization.